We'll just wait a bit while people filter in. I'm going to start.
I should have a plant here. I feel like it's a little empty on this side. I need like a big fig plant or something.
Zoom feng shui. I love it.
Great. So I see the attendees the numbers are increasing slowly. So that's wonderful. And we are recording. So to all the panelists, we're now live. Yay. We'll just wait a few minutes and let people filter into our Zoom room. Okay. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone and good afternoon. My name is Julie Snorik and I'm a board member of the Wyndham World Affairs Council, and I'm going to be moderating today's event. My colleague and the new chair of the Wyndham World Affairs Council, Claire Gillis, will be handling the technical side of this talk. We are most pleased to welcome 5 panelists today to share with us a talk that's titled The Intersectionality of Gender-Based Violence. And I'll be introducing each of those panelists individually before they give their opening remarks. Just a few housekeeping notes. In February, we'll be hosting Scott Cooper, the pastor of the Center Congregational Church in Brattleboro, to talk about celebrating Black, Indigenous people of color. And his talk will be on Monday, February 18th from 5 to 7 p.m. Like all of our other events, our lecture today is free and open to the public. And as you all may know, we're the smallest member of the national organizations for the Wyndham Affairs Councils of America, and we're run entirely by volunteers. Annual memberships support our operating expenses, and if you're interested in becoming a member, you can find further information where you access this Zoom event or on our website. So today's talk will begin with each individual who's on the panel, starting off with some brief remarks, and then we'll open for some question and answer. This is also being recorded, and we'll be posting this to our YouTube site and also to our website afterwards. If you're interested in asking a question, please use the chat function, please use the question and answer function in Zoom and do not use the chat function. And Claire Gillis will be helping to field the questions and help with the technical aspects of this talk. So this topic is particularly important to me, and it's something that I've thought about for quite a long time. And especially since I became more involved in working in West Africa and working with women in that part of the world. When I've been thinking about how this idea of intersectionality of gender-based violence is defined, I found an interesting definition from UN Women. And it says, intersectionality is a method of practice that challenges the idea of sameness. We as women are not all navigating the same version of womanness. And in doing so, we need to take into account that women are situated differently and encounter inequality in different ways. So to think about those issues, we've brought in some panelists to speak from their own expertise. Some of them are practitioners, some of them are doing research on topics similar to this, and they're each going to share in their own individual way how this topic has meaning for them. So to start off, I'm going to invite Mei-Ling Ellerman, who's a visiting scholar at the Center for Global Development and Sustainability at Brandeis University. She conducts interdisciplinary research on all forms of power, control, and subordination exercised over members of vulnerable groups, and the sociocultural, sociopolitical, moral, psychological, and cognitive factors that influence these responses. Her newest research project addresses domestic violence against African American and Black women and Chinese immigrant women in Massachusetts, the obstacles that they face to self-advocacy, and the challenges that they face with the justice system. She's been working with community partners, and she uses her findings to increase awareness and create change. Ellerman's past research on subordination has been supported by UNESCO, Fulbright, and the David L. Boren Fellowships. Ellerman earned her PhD from the Australian National University. Mei-Ling?
Thank you so much, Julie. And I'd like to thank the Wyndham World Affairs Council for inviting me to share my research today. It's really such a pleasure being with you. So today I'm going to talk, my talk is based on my research and my pilot interviews with Black survivors in low-income areas in Boston, Massachusetts. So I found that an intersectional and a historically informed approach is really critical to even starting to understand the experiences of Black survivors in the US and why so many cannot seek help or trust the criminal justice system. And also, as a side note, I want to say that I'm using the term Black out of respect to Black feminist literature, and because that's a term that most of the survivors are using. So I am studying how Black survivors' experiences of abuse and their responses have been affected by the historical context of racism, marginalization, and mistreatment from slavery onwards, up to what we're seeing as a current impact of police violence, mass incarceration, and what we could call socioeconomic segregation. Many Black women survivors, who are often also single heads of household, are trapped by far more than domestic violence. Their experiences, for example, are shaped by their precarious work, the inadequate schools and housing, street violence, drug dealers, and their everyday experiences of fear, racism, and sexism. They also contend with inadequate and often unhelpful, or sometimes even absent policing, the intense social pressure to protect their Black men from the police, and the fear that they themselves will be arrested or brutalized, and their children taken away. These structures of segregation and control may have changed over the last few hundred years, but they are still quite recognizable. So what are their lived experiences actually like? I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm going to be drawing upon the words of a survivor who chose the pseudonym of Lady Rage. She shows why Black female survivors like her are trapped, yet cannot seek help, in part because they must think of the repercussions on their abusers. She said, well, we, 9 times out of 10, won't call the police because we don't want to be the ones to put them in jail, because one phone call from us can ruin 5, 7, 10 years of their life. You calling for help, and all they're doing is showing up to prosecute. They aren't there to help the family. They aren't going to get the man counseling, because 9 times out of 10, it's a mental health thing, some tragedy. They aren't going to investigate that or ask him, they're just going to lock him up. So you are always caught in that spoke wheel. You want the help, but will this help cause you more pain? Because if he's locked up for 5 to 7 years, he's going to be mad at you. He ain't going to want to help you no more. He ain't going to be able to get a job, so he ain't going to be able to help you no more. So is it worth? Is the financial cost worth this phone call? Will this 30 days of no violence cause me 5 to 7 years of no help or complete abandonment? That's a question that a Black woman has to ask when she picks up the phone to dial 911. Or will she even get shot by the police? That's a new thing that's happening. We are dying when we call for help. They come and shoot up our whole house, our kids, me, my husband, my grandma, pops. That's an extra added fear that a woman has when calling 911. Am I going to end up dead? From Lady Rage's account, we can see how racism is entrenched in the criminal justice system, the same system that incarcerates disproportionate numbers of Black women and men, and which has become known for racial profiling and police brutality. We should also remember that the roots of American policing include 1.5 centuries of Southern slave patrols. White volunteers were empowered to use brutal tactics to hunt down and control enslaved people. Gary Potter stated that even when more formal police departments developed in the North, the mostly white police forces were supposed to control the, quote, dangerous underclass, which included African Americans, immigrants, and the poor. One result of this unrelenting exposure to multiple forms of oppression, violence, and control is that I believe that the survivors often live in a persistent state of trauma and vigilance. And what is happening now during the pandemic? They don't trust the criminal justice system. DV shelters have very few spots to offer. and DV service providers can only offer virtual support. Bernadine Waller noted that because of systemic racism, Black women would rather remain with the enemy they know rather than leave and contend with a support system that has failed them. However, during this pandemic, there has really been a dramatic rise in the severity of domestic violence and in Black survivors' urgency to leave. They're calling, asking for emergency housing because they want to leave their abusers right away. One reason why fewer BIPOC survivors seek help from the justice system is that legislation on restraining orders is weakened by the gendered racism internalized by many of those who carry out the law. Also, restraining orders can only save lives if the abusers respect them, and they do not help the victims to survive on their own or help to reform the abusers. As Lady Rage demonstrated, once survivors engage the justice system, they can lose what little control that they have left. This is why there's been a movement towards transformative or restorative justice approaches, which generally involve the victim, perpetrator, and community. And they're meant to help the victim start to heal and recover. Vermont has done cutting-edge work on restorative justice, and in 2018 evaluated how it might work for domestic violence survivors. It would be initiated by the survivor, provide her the opportunity to safely voice her experiences and needs, and ask for accountability from her abuser. We need culturally specific programs that empower survivors and heal their communities, and that take into account each community's specific challenges. Now let's look at the role of racism and sexism in Black survivors' attempts to obtain help. Police officers, translators, judges, attorneys, and others are all involved in implementing legislation on domestic violence. Trainings may not be sufficient for these individuals to rid themselves of the gendered racism that is systemic in our society. Survivors need to trust that the courts and police can help them. If they are further traumatized or disbelieved, they are unlikely to seek such help again. Lady Rage was denied a restraining order 3 times. The 4th time, a social worker threatened to file a 51A, which is a report of child abuse or neglect, if she did not go to court that very day. A single mother, she had to leave her daughter and younger son at home alone. She waited in court anxiously for her abuser to be brought in from jail where he had been detained the night before. In the afternoon, after her daughter texted her a photo showing that her son had just cut his foot, she told the victim witness advocate, "I need to go. I can't stay any longer." The advocate told her the cut doesn't look that serious and that she had to stay if she wanted the restraining order. The judge also knew that her child had been injured and that she wanted to leave. He deliberately called her case last at 5 p.m., long after her abuser had arrived. And then immediately after the hearing, she went home and took her son to the hospital. They still filed a 51A against her. Her experience with the judge demonstrates how easily survivors can be re-victimized by the system that is meant to protect them. And her account was notable for the judge's blatant gendered racism and lack of compassion. He told her, "If you want this restraining order, you are going to stay here and wait for it. I'm not calling this case before he arrives at the courthouse, so you can either do it my way or leave." She said, "He kept asking me the whole time whether I wanted to go through with the restraining order." She told me that even before her abuser arrived at the courthouse, he called me up to the front and said, "Listen, I understand that people get into these little arguments over the weekend because you're all drinking." I said, "I wasn't, he was." He said, "This sounds like a little argument that went a little too far. Are you sure you want to do this to the rest of his life?" Lady Rage said that the judge wanted to deny her the restraining order and told her that she needed to have experienced physical assault or sexual misbehavior. Note this term. He said, "I just feel like he had a bit too much liquor in his system." Lady Rage told me that the judge only granted 6 months because my sister was there with a recording of his phone call, and he said that he wanted to kill me. If he hadn't said that he wanted to kill me, the judge would not have granted it. After hearing her lived experience, it becomes clearer why so many survivors of color cannot trust the criminal justice system and may only seek help if their lives are in imminent danger. This judge viewed Lady Rage through a lens of racism and misogyny, drawing heavily upon stereotypes of aggressive Black women who cannot possibly be victims. The judge blamed her for potentially ruining her abuser's life by applying for this restraining order, a statement which draws upon the concept of racial loyalty, or the ethical expectations for Black women to protect Black men at all costs. The racialized gender stereotypes about Black women have their roots in white supremacy. Representations like the Jezebel, the sexually aggressive Black woman who is a predator rather than a victim, serve to dehumanize Black women and justify their enslavement and mistreatment. The judge drew upon two such overlapping stereotypes, that of the angry Black woman who would be complicit in any violence, and the strong Black woman who also could not possibly be a victim because she is so emotionally resilient and impervious to harm. So I will end my talk now by returning to the topic of legislation. Most states' legal definitions of domestic abuse only cover physical and sexual violence. And this leads to a legal focus on the severity or the frequency of these incidents, what Evan Stark refers to as the violent incidents model. This is really problematic. First of all, because it does not reflect our current understandings about domestic violence, and it leads the public to think that domestic violence is physical violence. The definition does not reflect the complex, varied, and often quite subtle tactics of abuse and control, and could contribute to the fact that it takes many survivors years and years to understand and acknowledge that what they are experiencing is abuse. I prefer the definition of coercive control, which several countries, and very recently, just this fall, California and Hawaii have included in their DV legislation. Coercive control is another way of defining domestic violence as deliberate behavior or tactics that an abusive partner uses to control his partner and to get what he wants. Evan Stark divides these tactics into coercion and control. For example, coercion could include threatening children or pets, the silent treatment, leaving for days, threatening suicide, and saying or doing degrading or shaming things. Controlling tactics could involve isolation and control over virtually anything, such as food or dress. The point really isn't what the abuser is trying to control, but rather getting his victim to be obedient. I will leave this with you to ponder. How can we best help BIPOC survivors when so many of their experiences of abuse do not qualify for restraining orders? And they cannot trust a criminal justice system, which is still really struggling with systemic gendered racism. We could start by normalizing discussions about domestic violence in our communities, expanding the legal definition, and aggressively addressing systemic discrimination in the justice system. Only by adopting an intersectional and participatory approach can we work with survivors to identify and rectify the many obstacles they face in obtaining help and regaining control over their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mei-Ling. Our next speaker, Aida Oualate, is the founder and president of Justice and Dignity for the Women of the Sahel. She was born in Kayes, Mali, where she lived through a civil war between the Malian government and Tuareg people, of which she is a member. Her career as a communication director focused on combating corruption and the financing of development initiatives in Mali. She holds an MBA in project management and has served as a liaison for cross-sector international organizations in both Mali and the United States. Aida currently resides in New York City.
Thank you, Jolie. Thank you so much, Jolie. And thank you for, having me. Thanks, Women Freedom Center, and thanks to my my co-panelist. Yes, just listen to my co-panelist, Mei-Ling, it makes me feel like we have, as African women, as activists in Africa, we have centuries and centuries and centuries to go before we reach, even though you have problem in the system, we don't have a system yet which recognize gender-based violence in Mali and the Sahel region. But there is a hope. So my name is Aida Oualate Hamahadi. I'm a president and founder of Justice and Dignity of Women of Sahel, which is a nonprofit organization created in New York City, but we work in the Sahel region in Africa. I will briefly share the map so that we are a little bit familiar to where is Sahel and which country are there. Let's see. Bear with me, I'm sharing. Let's share my screen briefly. Oh, sorry. I have a problem sharing my. Okay, this is just a quick map of the Sahel region. It's a savanna in a desert region between the savanna and desert in Africa. But our work is mainly in 6 countries. So we have Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. That's a little bit to tell you where is Sahel and which country we covered. So now let's talk about who we are and what we do. So we are a group of volunteers of reflections and initiative whose main objective is to combat physical and sexual and any type of violence towards women and the girls and gender-based violence, basically. We are a team, a volunteer, and we work with team and partner. We intend to help break the silence and lift the taboo around gender-based violence in order to assist our sisters, daughters, and mothers around the world to denounce high and loud their sufferances. No religions, to my knowledge, allow gender-based violence. From what Islam teaching us, a slightest evidence of violence against a wife, a woman, automatically calls for a divorce. Yet we have a lot of Muslim and other religious leader who uses religion in their own culture, which legitimize gender-based violence. JDWS has relations with imam in the Sahel and here in the US. They help us in raising awareness by telling their followers that Islam does not allow violence. JDWS is mainly focused on the fight against against GBVs. But we criticize, fight anything that diminishes the value and place of women in society. I'm gonna go through a little bit of basics, statistics. The percentage of women who agrees or just think it justifies beating and violence. And in Africa, Mali has 72.6% women thinks that they justify the violence against themselves. In Niger, we have 59.6%. Burkina Faso, we have 43.5%. Mauritania, we have 26.6%. In Senegal, we have 29.6%. We have 96% in rural and 92% in urban areas, women who are subject to some form of female genital mutilations. JDWS has conducted a study of effects of COVID on GBVs in Sahel region. As a result of this study, it was found that out of a total number of women, girls in the 6 countries surveyed, the rates of domestic violence, whatever physical or verbal, rose from 40.63% before COVID to 52.18% during the pandemic crisis. The result of this study shows in the 6 countries the following trends. Chad has the largest increase in domestic violence. Senegal rises from 81 of domestic violence to 96. Mali is the second country with a high rate of 43% before COVID against 54. Niger from 5 to 13%, Burkina Faso by 10 against 16. Mauritania compared to the other Sahel countries suffers less the impact of COVID crisis, 19.11%. The organization that I have the honor to share has set itself the goal of contributing to the development of Sahelian women through full and active citizenship for the common good. In this regard, GDWS has opted for promotion and support of women initiatives. The organization's or participation in capacity buildings, activity for women through theoretical and practical training, contributions to advocacy in favor of women's health, promoting the exchange of ideas and experience between target groups, promotions and use of new technology for women. Through this NGO, we hope to work on preventions and contribute to the fight against this social problem by providing maximum assistance to female victims of violence. We had, on a voluntary basis, started the fight several years ago through informal assistance through human rights monitoring of incidents of violence against women in the Sahel country, particularly in Mali, and by coordinating with various government and non-government partners in order to alleviate suffering and restore dignity to women and girls. Through the creation of this NGO, we intend to formalize and to coordinate activities to combat violence against women with the various partners, both inside and outside Mali and the Sahel region. GDWS aim to build a network where solidarity, sharing and exchange promote positive human values that account for gender equality and establishment of a non-violent society. Violence against women and girls remain significant in communities across the Sahel region, but the main problem is the failure to report the harm suffered by the victims. The atrocity of violence with negative repercussion on the physical, mental, and social level of the victim should encourage actors to take actions to combat domestic violence. This necessarily involves strengthening the existing framework, coupled with the intensification of awareness-raising actions. These actions aim to acknowledge the rightful place of women in the community by recognizing their rights. We recommend, among other things, a synergy of actions of NGOs and other actors involved in the fight against violence, harmonization of intervention tools and mechanisms, establishment of an updated database of action against gender-based violence, training of health workers and security personnel in the areas of receptions and advice for victims of GBVs. The establishment of coordinated prevention care and support mechanisms. I will leave you, I'm not using my 15 minutes, but I will leave you with this. I think this is each and every one work. Together, we must continue this work and we will make a difference in the lives of these women and generation of women to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aida.
Thank you.
Very powerful words. The next panelist is Dr. Patricia Pedroza González. She's a Latina Mexican scholar activist, speaker, and performer, and she teaches at Keene State College within the interdisciplinary programs of the Women's Gender Studies. So her scholarly work focuses on a multidisciplinary examination of cultural understanding of bodies and survival. Her creative writing is about rituals and spirituality. She's been published in Arizona University Press, and her activist work is at Moriela Michoacan, Mexico, where she works with survivors of torture, criminal violence, and mothers and daughters murdered by femicide. Patricia.
I'm sorry, I could not unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much for the organizers of this panel. And thank you. I'm so honored to be sharing with all these wonderful co-panelists. And of course, all the time, it's very hard to follow a sequence more when we are hearing what obviously are complex and sad realities. And so, yeah, basically my daily interaction, it is in a privileged context, and that means inside of a college classroom. I'm a full-time teacher of women gender studies at Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire. And honestly, it's a very privileged place to teach about that. Totally different of my work in Mexico, which honestly, I did not prepare in that sense because that matters for intersectionality to me, how I present that. And because my conflicts with the US policies against Mexico or with Mexico are very painful all the time. So in fact, this term, I really want to emphasize that intersectionality, of course, is a beautiful tool to analyze and put in context several realities. However, it is not new, and it is very important that women, more women, we recognize how we create theories and how we create tools for change. And so I will say, like, the first problematic intersection in the context of the US, it is inside of the suffragist movement when white and Black women needed to decide who will get the right to vote. Later in the 60s, obviously in the context of the civil rights movements, and I'm pointing only US context, again, the problem of race and civil rights movements was a huge intersection. And it's absolutely in the 70s, 80s, 90s that Black feminism in the United States taught us about this term. And it's very important to emphasize that because the umbrella of women of color, which is a term that is absolutely North American used, we go outside and we may use other terms, but the terms of women of color, that it's a huge, huge umbrella, and huge groups never will be easy even to be addressed by intersectionality. And so that means each community, each group has the right and the responsibility to contextualize our problems. And so I'm just so happy that we are talking about this, because we are in huge fraternity and solidarity, and at the same time, we are facing very, very complicated different situations. As Aida pointed, how we use or how we have the systems or we don't have the systems. Specifically, I really emphasize this because we are so accustomed to hear about victimizations with marginalized communities, but power and privilege works in a very dialectical way. And to me, since 2016, I am emphasizing that in other contexts, in other countries, where we talk about women as victims, and we don't address groups in privilege. For example, while other countries is very complicated, and in fact, we may believe we don't have the same approaches of gender inside of our institutions, but at least we have more women in administrative roles. And so in 2016, the United States suffered a very painful, for me, backlash. Again, like for the first time, they had a woman very close of the White House, and the backlash was the most horrible backlash that I have experienced as activist. And so I just could not believe it, I'm very honest. And so that also places like, okay, you may have a system that has room, but anyway, when a woman is in power, very different directions are very interesting happening. And so this concept is beautiful, is wonderful, is complex. And I think that we are so brave to address it because never will be the same for everybody. So in my personal Latina context, in my Latinx, Latina identity, clearly I live in what I consider interacting a gender intersectionality, nationality, sexuality, citizenship, and language. And so a Latina intersectionality or Latinx intersectionality, it will emphasize, and I cannot speak in the name of all Latinas because it's a huge umbrella as well, but gender, race, multiracial, ethnicity, class, sexuality, language, tradition, citizenship, nation are interacting, and among others, because I can add and add and add, disabled, obviously queer, the Afro-Latino or Black Latino complexity. So I can add and add. And I will say that another way to share you about this, I can say these are words, but in my personal work, I said how I can say this also in another way. And so I will share this poem.
Somos y en el camino.
Oh, I think that I'm sorry, I did not put, you cannot hear, right?
So I think if you share your screen again, and then you start the poem, then we should be able to see the image.
No andamos.
Yeah. That time it worked.
Con mi latina and pickups by Swansea Roths. The Roths are my relationships. And my feelings are olor a pan dulce.
Nothing is happening, right?
Migrantes somos y en el camino andamos. When you go to another place, you constantly reinvent yourself. You make a new persona. Somos migrantes y en el camino andamos. Aquí vengo con mi latina mestiza staff. Soy las enseñanzas de mi madre. Vamos caminando. I walk the geography of myself. I see sedans and pickups by Swansea Roths. The Roths are my relationships. And my feelings are olor a pan dulce y buñuelos, sabor a pozole, el guisadito de nopalitos, arroz con pollo y mole poblano. And my flavors are from corundas. Cada vez que le canto al dolor, my words are not your grammar guides. My words are my broken English. My words despiertan a medianoche temblando de coraje e impotencia. Currently enrolled in practicum survival, I read my notice of entry. Complete address and telephone number. The above consent, your words may not be used to request records. Let me know in advance of your travel plan. failure to notify. Are you feeling any other petition with this one? Have you ever filled an immigrant petition for any person in this petition? Dean's signature. Aliens' present occupation and summary of prior work experience. Are you H-2A or H-2B visa? Unpredictable. Temporary need is check 1. In support of the II 234-345 petition for your due consideration, together approve labor condition, occupation, valid and professional evaluation. Signature of the person. This poem is not evidence of identity, age, or status claim. Somos migrantes y en el camino andamos. My roots. Mis abuelas son madres conectadas a la tierra y me traen nuevas siembras. Me dejan mis huellas llenas de flores. Escogeré entre estas flores y la tierra entre mis manos, sembraré mis ideas fragmentadas y pariré movimientos de vida. Sacaré entonces la rabia atascada en la garganta. What was an unfamiliar topography is now my geography, made by lakes, the fields, the forest, the distinctive rural essence, and the frosthaves emerging on my body. I hear my friends, bring your kayak and a sandwich, when the ponds and loons make their invitation to come. Somos caminantes. This poem is not evidence of identity, age, or status claim. However, this alien has presented enough evidence and a summary of prior work experience. Currently enrolled in practicum survival. If they took away everything from me, I will have my words from my tongue. I will speak from my heart. If they took a leg, I will dance in one foot. A hand to write my Spanish words, para escribir mucho amor. Aquí vengo con mi latina mestiza staff. Somos migrantes y en el camino andamos. My words are not your grammar guides. My words are my broken English. My words describe my October extravagance when I pick up my own apples and sign for my snowmobile club membership. The roths and wild turkeys, así te sabe Swansea and cafecito con leche. Your way of thinking has broken and separated my partes, la espiritual, la física material, la mental psíquica. Mi expresión quedó fragmentada, pero así vengo with my Latina mestiza staff. Mi identidad dividida y mi corazón repartido. Somos migrantes y en el camino andamos. Sembramos flores y bailamos los caminos. We are migrants. We walk the way. We dance the roads. We flower our path.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
Thank you.
So wonderful.
Thank you. All right. So I'm done.
All right.
Oh my God.
So the next speaker is Willow O'Feral, and she's the award-winning director, producer, and cinematographer of 2 feature documentary films. Her newest film, Sisters Rising, is a feature documentary about 6 Native women fighting to restore personal and tribal sovereignty in the face of sexual violence against Indigenous women. This film was recently awarded several awards, including Best Documentary Feature Film at the American Indian Film Festival. Willow also helped found Southern Vermont, an organization working on, I'm sorry, I seem to have missed parts of that introduction. I'll let Willow describe that. And Willow is a member of New Day Films, the longest running distribution cooperative for independent documentary filmmakers in the United States.
Thanks, Julie. And thank you for having me on this panel. I feel very honored, such good company. So I wanted to share my trailer for Sisters Rising. It's 3.5 minutes. And then maybe after that, I'll talk a little bit more about my work. So let me see if I just learned how to screen share. Let's see if I can do it again. Can someone give me a thumbs up if they see it?
What if a woman is getting raped or beat and she's screaming? How many times have you heard where nobody called 911? Nobody did anything.
When I was about 2 years old, I started seeing my mom getting beaten. I seen her crying a lot. I seen her sexually assaulted.
One drove, 2 held her down, and the 4th one raped her. They knew they were coming here to hunt. They knew they were going to come here and rape with impunity because they can.
Racism is ever present in the lives of Native women. Predators are attracted to them. They see her and they think safe victim.
The oil industry brought the workers, the transients, the man camps.
1 year ago, there were 48 registered sex offenders. Now there are over 600 registered sex offenders.
2 men basically were branding these young women with these tattoos saying, "You're our property."
You have a huge influx of men who feel entitled to money and resources and women. There's an assumption that Native bodies and Native land are open for anyone.
If you are a tribal woman and you were raped on Native land, tribes don't have any authority over that perpetrator if he's a non-Indian, even if he's your husband.
Tribes can't prosecute most non-Indians for things they do to Native women on the reservation.
We have mothers who call local county sheriff's departments reporting their daughters missing only to be told, we have better things to do with our time.
The federal system simply has ignored Native women. They are the responders and they don't respond. It's almost like Native women are rapeable because there's not going to be any accountability.
Don't women on tribal lands deserve their constitutional right of equal protection? Ain't they women?
So from here, choose a side.
My aim becomes healing and helping women realize just how strong they are.
I know what that fear is. I know how it grips you. I want to bring them to justice.
Tribal sovereignty is integral to ending rape, and at the same time, ending rape is integral to tribal sovereignty.
These are human rights violations. Only human beings can fix this issue by creating social change.
I'm not going to be beaten down. This isn't where I end. This isn't where I stop my life.
That's where the revolution is going to happen, when those women are transformed.
There's only a few of us that speak out and then, oh, they're radical. Are we really radical, or are we just trying to get out the truth?
All right. So I started Sisters Rising 6 years ago with my partner, Brad Heck, and Tantu Cardinal is our executive producer and Jada Gray Eagle is our co-producer. And we spent most of our time on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, which is home to the 3 affiliated tribes of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations in northwestern North Dakota. And ended up sort of the project kind of ballooned into this following these 6 women, not all of whom are on Fort Berthold, but most of them are, who are all on one level or another tackling the problem of violence against Native women, and whether it be on a legislative level or grassroots or Indigenous women's self-defense course. One of the women, Chelsea, introduced tribal legal code to prosecute sex trafficking, because if you don't have a legal code written to prosecute something, you can't actually prosecute it. In working on this project, we sort of started narrowing down the thesis of the film to talk about the interracial violence statistics, which is really remarkable because most violent crimes in the United States are committed within the race. So a white woman is most likely to be raped by a white man, and other major crimes that applies. Usually, statistically, that's most common. The only exception to that general rule is Native women. They are most likely to be attacked and raped by non-Native men, mostly white men. And we were obviously super alarmed by that and wanted to know why, and had our suspicions, which would be, colonialism and racism. And that is obviously, I think, the root of it. But also there is the issue of, which luckily is becoming more and more known in the US, but still is not as much in the mainstream knowledge as I think it should be, which is that tribes have been stripped of their jurisdictional authority over non-natives when it comes to major crimes. And this happened through a series of court decisions, Supreme Court decisions, and congressional decisions. And our documentary is really an argument for restoring tribal sovereignty and legal jurisdictional authority over non-native people who commit crimes against Native people on Native land, which seems to me like a no-brainer. At the end of our film, Sarah Deer, the legal scholar, attorney, and professor who you see speaking in the trailer, is speaking in front of Congress to support the Violence Against Women Act, Reauthorization Act, which right now at this minute is still in Mitch McConnell's graveyard of bills which are not being passed. The Violence Against Women Act was a groundbreaking piece of legislation that actually Joe Biden helped author in the mid-90s, I believe, and it's supposed to be reauthorized every 6 years. But the Republicans constantly conservatives take issue with many things in the bill, including transgender rights, which was kind of their Republicans' main issue this time around. Before the reauthorization, before that, it was Native rights. They object to giving tribal courts the authority to try non-Native people. And they really have no basis for that. They claim that tribal courts won't be fair to non-Native people, but there's no basis for that. In fact, they've done findings that tribal courts are intensely careful when they have tried non-Native people, because they want to continue to be able to exercise sovereignty. And I wanted to say some other things. So this is the postcard for Sisters Rising. And then my other documentary, Break the Silence, I actually made right here in Brattleboro with the help of the Women's Action Team, which is what Julie was mentioning. The Women's Action Team was founded by a bunch of local women here in the Brattleboro area. Right after Trump was first elected, we were all so enraged and just demented by grief and horror that we kind of came together and started this very scrappy local feminist group. And out of that work, we did many demonstrations and different banner drops and all kinds of fun things. And Break the Silence came out of that. It's 18 local women, diverse group of local women in the Southern Vermont area, sharing very personal, raw stories of reproductive and sexual health from their own lives. And it's an amazing mix of women. I know that, you know, we don't have the reputation for being super diverse here in Vermont, but there's a lot of women of color, trans women, queer women, straight women, white women, lots of different ages, you know, young. We have a teenager up to an elderly woman who had experienced abortions before Roe v. Wade, so back alley abortions, and so many different stories about just under the entire umbrella of reproductive justice. And it was really important to us. So I directed the film, but I had a lot of support from the women in the Women's Action team. And it was really important to us to adhere to kind of the idea of reproductive justice, which I think was at least in part coined by Loretta Ross, who helped found Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective in the South. And I feel like this really ties into our topic of intersectionality in gender-based violence on this panel, because I'll read you real quick the, oh no, I started this. I wanted to read you the definition of reproductive justice that Sister Song uses. Sister Song defines reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And I love that definition because it's so inclusive. You know, and it goes back, I know that someone had touched on, I think Patricia, how white feminism often like has their own focus, and they have kind of had the stage for a long time for their interests. But women of color, you know, it's when you think of white feminism and reproductive justice, I think of abortion rights, which are very important, but you also need, if your definition of reproductive justice is safe and sustainable communities to raise your children or not have children safely, you know, that includes not being forcibly sterilized, which women of color have experienced in this country and are still experiencing. We know that immigrant women detained at the border in detention centers are being forcibly sterilized right now. And so, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but just a few more statistics about Native women and gendered violence. 70% of, this is according to the Bureau of Justice, 70% of perpetrators of sexual violence against Native women are not Native. And at least you saw in the trailer, 1 in 3 Native women will be raped in her lifetime as a Department of Justice statistic. We know that that's under, in fact, I had a hard time meeting a Native woman who hadn't been assaulted in her lifetime. And, you know, sexual violence is the most underreported of crimes. So whenever you hear a statistic, you may be startled, but you can know that you should be even more startled because it's usually worse. And that was something I also found in Break the Silence, my local project, this one, is that half of the 18 women, trans women and cis women that I spoke to, I never asked them about rape or sexual violence directly because I was actually trying to avoid that subject because I was still working on Sisters Rising. But I did, one of my icebreaker questions was, can you tell me about your first sexual experience? And I hadn't thought about it ahead of time, but it turns out half of those 18 women, their first sexual experience was coercive, was being raped or molested. And it was really, it shook me to my core. Obviously, working on Sisters Rising shook me really hard too, and was really, really damaging emotionally for a long time. But just to find that women in my community, you know, people that I walked by every day on Main Street in Brattleboro, you know, that's like, so that half of those women, it was just really shattering and upsetting. And so I think, obviously, it's an issue that pervades all of our lives. And if you don't think it is in your life, you just haven't talked to enough women, probably. So yeah, I could go on and on, but I think we're at 5 p.m. So we should probably open it up to questions. Oh, but the last thing I'll say is this book by Sarah Deer, who's the brain on legs, who's in our documentary. She's an attorney, legal scholar, Native woman, Muskogee Creek woman. She now teaches at the Kansas University. This book really just, if you want to know more about why the levels of violence against Native women, this is the book to read. This is like the Bible on it. So my last plug.
Thank you so much, Willow. That was so rich. And thank you for sharing the clip from your film as well. I hope everybody gets a chance to see it. So we have one more speaker, and we have Sherry from the Women's Freedom Center. And as some of you may know, the Women's Freedom Center is a Brattleboro-based domestic and sexual violence resource organization, and they represent Windham and Southern Windsor counties. So they're supporting survivors of gender-based violence of all genders, and they've been doing this work for over 46 years in this community. So Sherry's not going to turn her video on, and that's to just respect the privacy of the advocates of the Women's Freedom Center, which is something we agreed to do. So thank you for being with us, Sherry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It really is an honor to be here on this panel of amazing activists. And thank you everyone who's participating this Sunday afternoon. I want to give us time for questions. So I'm going to kind of just quickly go over for folks who maybe aren't as familiar, the work of the Women's Freedom Center. As Julie mentioned, we are the Domestic and Sexual Violence Resource Organization. This year we turned 47 essentially. And we are committed to supporting survivors of all genders. The most important thing we want to let our community know is that all of our services, crisis services, outreach services, everything has remained intact through this COVID pandemic, and will continue to do so. And so, you know, some of our vital services are a confidential 24-hour crisis hotline that is answered year-round by paid advocates. We also have a number of different confidentially located shelters where people can stay, again, all genders, but for the most part, it's women, very often women with kids. They can stay for several days, weeks, up to a number of months or longer, depending on their needs. And probably the most vital support that the Freedom Center and any program like ours offers is individualized safety planning with survivors at any hour of the day or night, based on exactly what's happening for them in that moment. Because I think, as we all know, you know, domestic violence is a pretty shifting landscape for anybody who's in it. Beyond that, we also do advocacy around the clock in all systems a survivor might encounter. So for instance, we're part of the 3 different area hospitals that we work with. We're part of the emergency room protocol. So anytime there's been a rape or sexual assault, an advocate will be there within 30 minutes. We also do advocacy within other systems. So, you know, it's come up already before, trying to get a protective order. That's something that advocates can help someone with 24/7. Advocacy within law enforcement, within DCF, for instance. So those are some of our crisis services. In addition to that, you know, like everybody else, we've moved a lot of our work online, but we still offer confidential drop-in support groups for survivors online. We can meet with people in person if that needs to happen. And we do year-round education and outreach for across the lifespan. So violence prevention, healthy relationships, bystander empowerment. So those are just some of the, that's just an overview of the Women's Freedom Center. And to give you a local snapshot, last fiscal year alone, the Women's Freedom Center supported 1,163 adults and their 418 kids. We sheltered a total of 125 people, again, all genders, though overwhelmingly women, moms, and kids. And we responded to over 1,900 hotline calls. And underscore here that we are not unique. You know, around the same time that we began turning 40 plus, et cetera, a lot of the other early grassroots feminist organizations like the Freedom Center, at least around the United States, began turning the same age, right? And so at this point, there are probably just under 2,000 similar programs around the US alone, who every day get an average of 20,000 hotline calls in this country alone. According to a recent Vermont crime report, about 60% of all the violent crime that's happening just in Vermont is happening inside of homes. And just over half of Vermont homicides are domestic violence related. And I think we've all probably heard this statistic that, you know, leaving a domestic violence relationship is actually the most dangerous time. Across the United States, 3/4 of all DV homicides actually occur if the person gets caught in the process of leaving or just after they've left. So that's our backdrop even before COVID, right? And so rewinding now to the middle of March of last year when the lockdown happened here in Vermont, our call volume immediately overnight dropped by about 50%. And that might sound like a welcome trend in this kind of work, but for all of us, it was actually a pretty ominous silence, right? Because we knew then, and we still know now, that we are still sitting on a lot of untold stories. And in that way, you know, as we've all talked about, we know that COVID, of course, has amplified inequities that already exist in our culture, but it has dramatically increased the risk for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And I think if we keep in mind that home is pretty much the most dangerous place for women in particular because of domestic violence, and you add to that that the most dangerous time is trying to leave, COVID has really created a perfect storm in this regard, right? So not only might exposure to the batterer have been increased exponentially because most of us are home a lot more. So the risk of violence, you know, has been extended. The rate and severity also with continued stress of confinement can also go up. But of course, with survivors stuck more at home now, their options, which are already limited, it's pretty much a pretty delicate obstacle course, even before COVID, to try to strategize a safe time to get a hold of an advocate on a hotline. But now their options, like how to do that, when to do it, their privacy to do it, has also, you know, those times have gotten briefer, perhaps more random and more rare. And that's why I said the most critical support that we and any advocates can offer typically is individual safety planning. Because again, fleeing for survivors is an absolutely unique process. There's no one size fits all for how that can happen. And, you know, in the past, I think it was not uncommon before COVID that our hotline call might be coming from somebody who would say, you know, I know my technology has been compromised. I left my cell phone in my car. I'm calling you from my desk phone at work right now because that's my only window of time. And again, right, all of that has come crashing down in so many ways for survivors. So that's what survivors are already up against, that level of risk. And we've had survivors even recently, you know, call us with just the random moment when they didn't realize they were going to have a few minutes. And there was a recent instance, actually was in the summer, and thankfully this one has a good ending, but this woman called us and she was whispering. She suddenly had these random couple minutes to call us. She was whispering for two reasons, because her kids, she had to quit her job because it was expected she would take care of them. She was helping her kids with their Zoom classroom in the next room. And while the abuser was out, she also had to be able to hear him come up the driveway so she could quickly hang up. And that was the way that, you know, COVID has really turned the dial up on what survivors are experiencing, including in our community. The isolation, as we know, is typically a tactic that most batterers use. And we have heard, of course, you know, around the world, I would say, of batterers, you know, they're opportunists. So whatever comes to hand works for them to increase power and control. And so they have used weaponizing of the isolation, right? We've talked about that already a little bit. And also even, you know, weaponizing the virus itself. And that has looked like any number of ways, not allowing precautions to be used, not wearing masks themselves, not allowing access to healthcare, including to, you know, blatantly sort of coughing in a survivor's face. I mean, this is a particular instance, and laughing, right? That she felt vulnerable to COVID. And so again, this is what we see of batterers sort of year round anyway, but COVID has given them this, it's played right into their hand in terms of getting power and control. And then adding to that, the additional challenge that survivors might feel if they're not working now, how am I going to put my life together? Maybe this is not the time to flee. They may not know. They may be afraid to come into a shelter because of the risk of COVID, or they may not know that all of our services, for instance, are still intact, as with many other programs. And so that's why, you know, we're so grateful for conversations like these and for everyone participating, because we as advocates are often not the first folks that survivors turn to year round, right? It might be any other friend or family member or community member or awesome coworker or just a neighbor that has it on their radar. And it's those engaged bystanders that, you know, we salute, because that's how advocacy fans out to the whole community. We're all advocates in this sense by being compassionate and aware. And so again, we really welcome conversations like this. And we're also open, we're not just a support at the Freedom Center for Survivors, but also to bystanders. And we have been getting those calls on our hotline. hey, you know, I'm home more now. I'm hearing this going on in my neighbor's house. I didn't realize what was up. What's the safest and, you know, most careful way I can let that survivor know that I'm willing to help or lend my phone, etc. So we welcome folks reaching out to us for that as well. And I do want to leave it open now for others to talk. So I'm going to pause there, but I'm certainly open to questions. And again, thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Sherry. And thanks to all the panelists for your wonderful comments and sharings. I wanted to start off just with questions that we've received already from the participants, and also encourage participants to send in your questions for the panelists. We have about 20 minutes for our follow-up kind of question and answer session. So if anyone does have a question, feel free to ask a question to the entire panel or to a specific panelist. So the first question is to you, Mei-Ling, and this person was curious about your use of the pronoun he, and he was wondering, or actually it's anonymous, so I don't know if it's a he or a she or what it is, but this person is asking, is it not also true that he's and she's are possibly also experiencing domestic violence or coercive control over their partners? So that was his question in relation to your.
Yes, thank you for the question. Certainly, I mean, of course, it's, you know, possible for women to be the abusers and for anyone to be the victims. But I was speaking out of the from the context of my own research, and right now my research is focused on women survivors. And also when Evan Stark, when he was really working with the concept of coercive control, he perceived it as within the context of a patriarchal society. He saw it as a gender-specific pattern of subordination, of coercive and controlling behavior, and which highlighted the gender subordination of women. So that was the context of my talk.
Thank you. And a question from Scott Cooper, who is one of our board members. And this is actually for all of the panelists. So I call on everyone to give a response if you have one. And that's in regards to women's internalization of the patriarchy and of misogyny, as in the opposition to women being in the place of power. Are there different dynamics at play between marginalized people of color women and white privileged women? I wonder if Patricia, you wanna start off?
I'm so bad. I'm the not politically correct person, and so you said that this person is in your board, and so probably you will not invite me anymore. But this is not my favorite question to answer. First, because if we live in this planet, we have internalized patriarchy and misogyny, all of us. So my first question will be, how much have you internalized that, and what are you doing to change that? About ranking women, already I think that I sent a kind of a statement about whiteness, white feminism, and women of color. And so the dynamic is the same. Patriarchal system constructed the binary, men and women. It's totally constructed. Men are socially constructed, women are socially constructed. But after that, of course, white men are constructed superior as Black men, and Black men are constructed superiorly as Black women. And all adults are constructed as superior to children, and able physically people are constructed superior to disabled physical people. And so the binaries, we can on and on and on. And so the dynamics of power among women are painful, are horrible, but they exist and exist in a lot of senses. Brief example, as Mexican woman, I got tired to be in a restaurant, for example, and the people address the man, if you are with a man, like, what are you drinking? What are you eating? It's like the woman does not exist. But here, living in New Hampshire, It's like I am sit down in a room in the same meeting with a white woman, and we say exactly the same ideas, but my idea never passed to the minutes, but the idea of the white woman is like, oh my God, that is a wonderful contribution. That is a wonderful idea. So after 20 years, I said, okay, I don't speak English, I'm invisible, I don't exist. And so of course that the internalization, it's in all of us, the ranks are in all of us, and just we repeat this kind of consequences.
I invite other panelists also, please. Aida.
Julie? Julie, yeah. Hi, Julie. Yes, can I a little bit add to what she's saying? I mean, it goes without saying that GBVs is aimed more at women and girls from precarious background compared to wealthy ones, but also all women are affected, to me. And also it's true that patriarchy is a system which weakens the powers of women, but even in non-patriarchal culture, the problem of GBVs persists. That's what I think.
Anyone else want to speak to this question? Okay. So we have a question from Maya Segura. She's also a board member. Thank you all for your important work daylighting gender-based violence. My question is for Aida. To what degree are adult women, female family members, complicit in female gender mutilation of girls? And to what extent do they want to change this practice?
That's a very, very interesting question. Actually, it's practiced by women. Women are the one who operate on the small girls. So it's sometimes it's a cause of discussion among parents. So some women don't want to, but the dad will say she has to because she will be viewed from other families and culture that she's not a fully woman when she grew up. So it's I think we have to really, women are the one who should be educated and should be sensitized, because men do not do it, but it's imposed by the culture. It's not a religious thing, it's culturally. And to me, it's a mean to control women, because, excuse my, it's a mean to control because it takes away her intimate, sensitive, intimate part of her body for her not to. So women have a lot to do. Women have to fight and do a lot of sensitization. Thank you. I don't know if I answered his questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And this question is for Willow. Willow, if and when employees of the oil companies rape or molest women on reservations, do the companies ever hold these employees accountable? And is there advancement in local regulation to help victims have legal support in identifying the perpetrators and charge them? Questions from Claire.
I've never heard of an instance of an oil company holding their employees accountable specifically, but I know that, so just a disclaimer, most of my knowledge is extremely minute, like it's based on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota during the Bakken oil boom, and I haven't been there for 5 years, so my knowledge is dated. But when the oil fracking boom started, and this tends to be typical of most oil booms, you know, there's very limited time where these oil companies are granted mineral rights and extraction rights. So they like rush in, they try to set up their infrastructure really fast, they extract as hard as they can. It's a 24/7 job. you know, they're pumping oil night and day, and then they leave when they're done, or when their lease goes up. So in the beginning of the Bakken oil boom in North Dakota, it was like totally the Wild West. Everyone described it as the Wild West. The oil companies were so desperate for able-bodied, you know, men to do this work that they were hiring anybody, and people were flooding from all over the country to work in the Bakken, including a lot of felons who have a hard time getting work elsewhere. And this included a lot of sex offenders. And because tribal jurisdiction is so tricky and so complicated, and it's not even, I can't even tell you what it is across the board, because it changes tribe to tribe, it changes state to state. The Fort Berthold Indian Reservation was smack dab in the center of the Bakken oil boom. And most of the fracking was done on the reservation. And the tribe couldn't get a handle on, because the oil companies weren't registering sex offenders, they were just hiring whoever. You know, the tribe had no idea. Usually if you are working on tribal land, you have to register with the tribal office. And if you're a sex offender, that has to be registered, but they weren't even doing that. And so it was really a free-for-all for a while. And there were lots of terrifying reports of things that were happening. There's this whole phenomenon of the man camp. Man camps are temporary, basically RV towns or trucker towns that pop up on the prairie out of nowhere, because there wasn't enough. I mean, it's North Dakota. There's not a lot of, you know, Fargo isn't even that big. And this is out in the middle of nowhere in the prairie. Like there wasn't enough housing to house these workers. So they would just park a truck in the man camp, which could just be anywhere off of a highway. And women were sort of disappearing. A couple of women, I mean, there were rapes, there were murders. A kidnapper, like a kindergarten teacher, I think, was abducted and raped and killed around the Bakken oil boom. It was really, really scary. And the women on Fort Berthold were terrified, and they stopped. You know, it used to be a place where you know everyone you see, and it became a place where you rarely see the other tribal members. And so women would be accompanied by a male member of their family to go to the grocery store. I felt really scared sometimes when I was there. Going into a gas station, I would like walk in, it would be all men except for the woman, the cashier. And they would all watch me as I walked down the aisle like I was a rabbit. I had just run into a band of coyote, you know. And it was really scary and weird. It's gotten better, because at least that's what I've heard, because the oil companies they were, you know, there was a lot of bad press about this. And so they started registering, they started not hiring felons, people with criminal backgrounds, especially sexual assault backgrounds and things like that. So sorry, it's a really long answer, but basically, I mean, companies typically, you know, capitalism, like companies don't usually do things for the right reason. They do things when there's pressure from the media or from legislators or something, or social groups to do the right thing. And so I think that's kind of a blanket answer, is that companies don't usually hold their own employees accountable. And tribal law enforcement and tribal courts can't, if they don't have jurisdiction over non-tribal members. So, you know, like Dawn White, the sergeant, she's the tribal cop in our film. She told me about how she would like go to the casino on the reservation because there was a complaint of a domestic violence situation or a brawl or like whatever. And she, you know, white men would like laugh in her face and say, "You can't do anything to me. You can't touch me." And it was such a weird, it's so weird, because say if a Native man from that reservation punched a white guy, like an oil rig worker, she could arrest the Native guy. But if the reverse happened, she couldn't do anything. And so to me, it's just so warped. It's so weird. And it has to change.
Thanks, Willow. So another question here to Aida, and then I think we might be moving to our last question, which is one of mine. So Aida, what are your thoughts on not only educating women, but the young men to help drive change in the culture over time in relation to genital mutilation, for example?
Thank you so much for these questions. This question is can be also related even to all type of GBVs, education and sensitizations. As I said earlier, we are working to have pass GBV laws in Mali for the past few years, but not possible. But to me, I think if we get to make education free and mandatory from first grade to university, all kids, and including in the curriculum GBV sensitizations and the pro and the cons and the versus culture versus religions. Because if you see none of the religions, none of those, monotheist religion, none of them, accept or allows GBVs, but yet it's practice. We use it culture, we use a lot. Our own weakness to have power over women to do all kind of things they've been doing to women. So it's really has to be everybody's job. It's not only girl or women's, because it's a cultural thing. So if we include that in basic education and making it mandatory, even when we have to force girls who are like underage girls to put them make them married very young, take them out of school. If we make the school mandatory, it will. I wouldn't say people will not be able to still practice that, but it will be less because they don't have to face. They will not have to face the financial hardship to keep their kids in school. So the education has a lot to do with it. If we emphasize on education and put money in education and we follow through, we can really diminish it in Africa. Is that answer the questions?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Aida.
Thank you.
I wanted to pose this question to all of the panelists, and I want to start off with Mei-Ling. So what are some ideas that you have about which we can do now as members of the public, of the community, to support survivors and to start to normalize these discussions about gender-based violence, about intimate partner violence in our schools and our communities?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I've been actually thinking about this in discussion with some other groups, and I'm part of a policing working group in my own community. So one of the things I've been thinking about is how our police can be resources for survivors. So for example, I've suggested that members of the community look at the homepage of their the town homepage and the police website, and to see if there's any resources for domestic violence. See if there's a tab related to domestic violence. And I would suggest, ideally, if it could have a definition more in line with that of course of control, but also to give the steps that a survivor might need to take, particularly now during the pandemic, to obtain a restraining order, what that process might look like, as well as other resources. And we've gone further. We've interviewed our local chief of police as a group, and we've asked about the officers. So how are their officers trained to help victims of trauma? Are they trained to work with survivors of domestic violence? So our particular police department does have 2 officers who are assigned to work with survivors. And also, are there any sort of advocates, co-response programs in the area where clinicians, social workers could accompany them on ride-alongs to talk with the survivors? So the only other thing that I might suggest, which I'm thinking about in our own community as well, Casa Mirna Vasquez, one of my partners, they have a program for BIPOC youth to become peer leaders and to train others in schools. So this speaks to normalizing discussions of domestic violence within the schools, with our youth. And so I was thinking that possibly, because it's during the pandemic now, they could do it virtually and work with groups of youth in our schools to talk about domestic violence, about healthy and unhealthy relationships, and train those youth to also lead groups to continue the conversation. So to make it more than just about Domestic Violence Month, Awareness Month, but to make it something that is going on, possibly work it into the curriculum as well.
I love that. Thank you so much. Just because of the time that we have remaining, I'm just going to pass this question now to Sherry. Sherry, I wonder if you might also just talk with us, since we have mostly a Brattleboro community audience here, about what are some of the ways that you see that as members of the public here in Windham County that we can address and normalize these discussions about domestic violence.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's a beautiful way to kind of close out because, you know, as I mentioned before, that is part of our work year round at the Freedom Center, having these deeper dive conversations about dismantling patriarchy, which we know harms all genders, unpacking the gender box, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, one of the sort of year-round ways is people can follow us on Facebook or, you know, go to our website and learn more about how they can get involved, womensfreedomcenter.net. But we're, first of all, you know, what's coming up soonest is a month-long dialogue that we're hoping to have with our community. And it's a collaboration with Brooks Memorial Library. And it's going to be 4 Thursday evenings from 7 to 8 p.m. starting February 11th. Again, they can find out more by following us on Facebook. We would love for audience members here tonight to join us for a month-long conversation where we will try to pull some of these strands apart. We're going to look at aiming for economic and legal justice, media literacy across the lifespan, bystander empowerment, really to address all the various forms of oppression, but in particular, domestic and sexual violence. And this is a super interactive 4 winter evening kind of forum. So we welcome people's questions and their own best thinking in that context. So again, womensfreedomcenter.net, and you can find out a lot more about it.
Great, thank you so much, Sherry. So thank you to everyone for participating in this discussion today. And just as a reminder, because we do have 2 individuals from organizations that would accept your donations, I just wanted to give a shout out to asking everyone to donate to Justice and Dignity for the Women of the Sahel and also the Women's Freedom Center. And also consider checking out the new film, Sisters Rising, that Willow spoke about. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. And it was such a delight to have this conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Please, please, please. Thank you. Thank you. Let's keep this conversation going on.
Yes.
Thank you.